As you all know, Australia is currently being affected by a tragic bushfire Australia-wide and causing a lot of loss of properties and lives. The Kisbara Temple has been collecting water, about 1 liter. I think yesterday's 7 p.m. was the closing time for collections. So those who wish to collect what we call donate water to this cause, you can Google on the website. There are some information regarding how you may wish to contribute water or any other contributions that you may like to have. So just a short reminder in that sense. On the 12th of January, Ajahn Nissarano will be going to do some offering of blessing somewhere else. So Bhante Murito will be coming to the BSP to offer teaching on that 12th of January, which is actually next Sunday. So that'll be good. Thank you, Ajahn.
Oh, thank you very much, Adrian. That's good. Yes, and we're very lucky with the fire, with the weather we're having here. Hopefully it's reaching East Gippsland and also New South Wales. It's very nice that that's cool change with the rain, but let's hope that helps reduce the fires or put them out. That would be very nice. And maybe later, when we go over to the vihara where the monks live, and we have the dana, we can do a chant that's a fire protection chant. So this is one that the Buddha recommended. That's come down from the traditions to protect us from fire. But of course, one of the interesting things for protection from fire is, of course, and the Buddha mentions that as a benefit, is loving kindness. Isn't that interesting? It would be interesting if it helped protect people from fire, so we'd see. So now is the time for the taking of the refuges and the 5 precepts, and also the chanting, and also the chanting recollection of Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha.
Venerable Sir, we do seek from you, for individual observance, the 5 precepts along with 3 gems. For the second time, Venerable Sir, we do seek from you, for individual observance, the 5 precepts along with 3 gems. For the third time, Venerable Sir, we do seek from you, for individual observance, the 5 precepts along with the 3 gems.
Right. Yeah. So it's very nice, as I always say, when someone requests on behalf of everyone, that's showing that it's a voluntary thing, and it signals to our mind this is something part of our individual practice, keeping the 5 precepts. And there will be no precept police following you around to make sure that you're keeping the precepts. No way. The CCTV camera is inside. We know. We know what we're doing. We know what we're saying some of the time. So now, if you'd like to, I'll chant the Namo Tassa. Oh no, we're doing it in English today, actually. That's right. Thank you. That's Savitri. So we'll do it in English. I'll do the homage to the Buddha 3 times, and then if you'd like to repeat it, and then I will do the going for refuge line by line. I'll say it, and then if you'd like to repeat it. Homage to him, the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the rightly awakened One. Homage to him, the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the rightly awakened One. Homage to him, the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the rightly awakened One. I go to the Buddha for refuge. I go to the teachings for refuge. I go to the noble monastics for refuge. For the second time I go to the fully awakened one for refuge. For the second time I go to the teachings for refuge. For the second time I go to the noble monastics for refuge. For the third time I go to the fully awakened one for refuge. For the third time I go to the teachings for refuge. For the third time I go to the noble monastics for refuge. This completes the going for refuge. You say yes, yes, Venerable Sir, you have few options. Yeah, it's a bit confusing, we don't do it very often. And now we can take the precepts one by one. I will chant them, and then if you'd like to repeat them. I undertake the training rule to refrain from taking life. I undertake the training rule to refrain from stealing. I undertake the training rule to refrain from sexual misconduct. I undertake the training rule to refrain from false speech. I undertake the training rule to refrain from intoxicating drinks and substances that reduce clarity of mind. Yeah, it's a bit of a long one, that one. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. But it's very, very good we know what the precepts are, because whenever we enter into any business deal, contract or whatever, it's good that we understand what we're getting into. And also it's a very, very good for our mindfulness if we know what we're aiming to keep. Mindfulness needs an object, and these 5 precepts are a very good object for us. So now we can do the recollection of the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha together. Such indeed is he, the Blessed One, is a worthy one, fully awakened by himself, consummate in knowledge and conduct, the Sublime One, knower of the worlds, incomparable master of those to be tamed, teachers of devas and humans, awakened and blessed. Well expounded is the Dhamma by the Blessed One, to be seen here and now, timeless, inviting one to come and see, leading onwards, to be understood individually by the wise. Well practiced is the Blessed One's community of noble disciples. Directly practiced is the Blessed One's community of noble disciples. Methodically practiced is the Blessed One's community of noble disciples. Properly practiced is the Blessed One's community of noble disciples. That is to say, the 4 pairs of humans, the 8 kinds of persons. This is the Blessed One's community of disciples, worthy of offerings, worthy of hospitality, worthy of a teacher's gift, worthy of reverential salutation, the unsurpassed field of merit for the world. Sadhu. Either way, good. And now we can do the Buddha's words on loving kindness in English. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties, and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm, and wise and skillful, not proud or depending in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing, that the wise would later reprove, wishing in gladness and in safety. May all beings be at ease, whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another, or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another, even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child. So with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will, whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness. One should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding, by not holding to wrong views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. There we are. Very good. And we extend that particularly to those people who are affected by the fire, the bushfires at the moment. Many, many people have been affected, and fortunately not so many people killed so far, so that's very good. So I'll just, for those who don't know me online, my name is Ajahn Nissarano. I've got to remember my name. And I'm an Australian monk who ordained with Ajahn Brahm in Perth now 23 years ago, really, because that's when I became a novice monk then. But I have been a bhikkhu, a fully ordained monk, 22 years, and 13 and a half of those years living in Sri Lanka and visiting Australia. These days, annually. So, oh, you want the that's good. Here we are. You want the device? Yep. That's it. Can you get it? That's it. Many devices. All right. There we are. That's good. So that introduces myself for those, particularly those online. Very welcome. Very nice that they have that opportunity to be with us. There's something special about being, listening to a talk, watching a talk while it's actually happening. So, Helen, please. There we are. Yes. There we are. Good. So, the background for this talk, or introduction for this talk, is that in the last couple of weeks I've been helping or edited a transcribed talk of Ajahn Brahmani's. Do people know Ajahn Brahmani? I think they do. Here they know him. He's one of the senior monks at Ajahn Brahm's monastery in Western Australia. And he was doing somebody in Sri Lanka wanted to make a little Dhamma, free distribution Dhamma booklet to mark the death anniversary, three-month death anniversary of her mother. And so she transcribed this talk and then asked Ajahn Brahmani's permission to print it. But of course, it has to go through a lot of editing, actually. He does a lot of work on it, actually, which is really good. And of course, you can improve on the spoken presentation. It has to be a little bit different too for the booklet. So I helped with that. And this booklet was about, what was it about? Why I am a Buddhist monk. Because he said, that wherever he goes throughout the world, people ask him, why are you a Buddhist monk? How did you become a Buddhist monk? Because, of course, he was born in Norway, so that's very unusual. The same for me in many ways. I'm born here in Australia. But I find that actually in Australia, people don't ask me that very much. In Buddhist countries, they ask you that quite a lot, because they see that you've come from, a very wealthy, or what they perceive very wealthy, prosperous background. And so they feel like we've given up so much to become Buddhist monks or nuns in a Buddhist country, in Sri Lanka, Thailand or Burma. But, of course, it fails to remember that the Bodhisattva, the Buddha, actually came from extremely wealthy background. And it was perhaps because of that experience of living in what they called the palace, that it was easy for him to give that up, because he knew that his happiness, his satisfaction, finding permanent happiness, finding a way beyond birth, old age, sickness and death, could not be found in the palace. He was looking for the happinesses of the mind. He had in the palace all the happinesses on offer for the body and the five senses. So it's good to remember that. This is the condition for somebody looking for a spiritual path, is this, not there yet, that sense of, having explored the material world, having explored the sense pleasures, and finding that there must be something more than this. Is that all there is? That's often the reaction. Is that all there is? So it inspired me. His booklet, his talk that has become a booklet, is based on the Kalama Sutta. People know the Kalama Sutta. It's probably one of the most famous suttas these days. Known about that the Buddha spoke. And I'll talk about that in some detail. That'll be the focus for this talk, actually. So it's and the Kalama Sutta is often seen as, they call it the Buddhist charter for free will, because it's appealing to direct experience, our experience. And this is a very important part of the Buddha's teaching, of course, is that we have to reflect on our own experience. And it's in that context we can develop the Noble Eightfold Path. But of course, if we reject any other source of outside ourselves, other than our own direct experience, any other guide, then we're rejecting, say, the Buddha, for instance, and looking to, as it were, become enlightened by ourselves. It's become a Samma Sambuddha, which is a tall order. So this is the background to this Kalama Sutta. It's very popular in the West. This idea, that we don't need to go beyond our own personal experience for guidance. And of course, I think it's very important to remember the Kalamas that the Buddhas teach. You can see it? It's good. Can you read it? It's very difficult. Don't worry, it just gives you the image. This is actually in the kitchen, a Dhanasala, over in the Sangha house. So you can read it there. I'll get it out. It's on the wall, so you can have a look at it then when we have the shared meal after this talk. But it's good to keep in mind that these people were not Buddhists, so they didn't have faith in the Buddha and his teaching and his guidance. And so that is why the Buddha is actually teaching them to go to their experience of what is wholesome and what isn't wholesome. It's very important that we remember that. I like what Aikima used to say about the Buddha. The Buddha she called him a spiritual genius. And it's true. We don't really appreciate how extraordinary such a person is. And it's like, it's not quite strong enough, really. Like somebody who goes to the moon, How many people have been to the moon? I think only one. Is it only one? One so far. And that person going to the moon can see the Earth from a very, very different perspective from us on the Earth. We could think that the Earth was flat. We could think that the sun goes around the Earth, all these things. But when you see it from the moon, it's very obvious that the world is, round, and the sun is not going around the earth. So this is the perspective that we get, that an enlightened being gets, and he shares with as many people as possible. And it's important that we appreciate the Buddha for what, as a spiritual genius, for instance, because it gives rise to these factors that actually can help us towards enlightenment. And these are called the 5 indriyas, or the 5 faculties, they call controlling faculties, usually they call it. And that is like confidence and faith. If we have confidence and faith in anything, then we will tend to do it, we'll tend to undertake it. So that confidence and faith in the Buddhist teaching, the Noble Eightfold Path that he outlined, that he presented to us, he taught us, that gives us the faith to practice it. This is the energy, the virya. And then, of course, we can apply ourselves, through, we call it sati, mindfulness. And this means, for instance, keeping the 5 precepts that we talked about today. That's a focus for mindfulness, as well as the present moment. We need both. And then for the mind to come together, once we have this sati, then the mind can come together in what we call samadhi. And it becomes powerful then. And then from that powerful mind that can look into things deeply, we can see things as they truly are. So this is very important, this gaining of confidence and faith in say, the Buddha, for instance, in this case. And I'd like to call this talk, I hope we get through all this actually, the basis for belief, because, it's really looking at, on the grounds that we tend to take on belief, we take on a view, a spiritual belief in this case, but it can apply to all beliefs, actually, the nature of all beliefs, and I'll be reflecting on some of that too. So this, I thought I'd give the background too, that this teaching comes from one of the collections of the Buddha's teachings. And the Buddha's teachings are huge. They're, we say, voluminous. There's so many of them. There are what we call 5 collections of his teachings. 4 of them are very, very famous, and the 5th one has got quite a lot of very famous things in it, like the Dhammapada, the Suttanapada, and the Therigatha, and so on. So these 5 collections of the Buddha's teachings were collected, and after the Buddha passed away, they had a council, and they arranged the teachings, as it were, in these 5 collections, and also the vinaya, we call it, the discipline or the rules for the monks and the nuns. And they were the teachings that were remembered of the from the Buddha's time. And of course, the person who remembered the most, who was that? Venerable Ananda, of course. He must have had, we call it photographic memory, but it's probably like we talk about an audiographic memory or something. There's probably a word for it in English. So we have these sources that go back to the time of the Buddha, and this talk comes from one of those collections. And as I mentioned, they're arranged. I'll just mention the 5 collections. One is called the long talks, or the long discourses of the Buddha. One's called the medium or middle length discourses or talks of the Buddha. One is the talks of the Buddha arranged by theme. One is the talks of the Buddha arranged by number of things covered in that talk. So today's talk comes from this collection. We call it the numerical discourses, or the talks that are arranged according to number. And it comes from the section on the 3s, we call it. So there are 3 things that are referred to in the Kalama Sutta, particularly greed, hatred and delusion. That's the 3, actually. I hope I haven't spoilt the ending. So they're the 4, the long, medium, the thematic and the numerical. But the last one is called the Khuddika Nikaya. And I had to look it up this morning. I thought, Khuddika, we usually translate it as miscellaneous, but it actually translates literally as the little one. And I think it's the biggest biggest collection because it sort of was open for a long time. It has things that came well after the time of the Buddha. And as I mentioned, the famous Dhammapada, Therigatha and Therigatha, these are the poems of the enlightened monks and nuns come in that, as does the Sutta Nipata. And it's very interesting, in these collections of talks by the Buddha, there are very many different presentations. They're not just straight talks or, as they say in Sri Lanka, sermons. They're often very lively sort of discussions, question and answer discussions. And this talk shows you that format. There's about 7 different types of presentation that the Buddha had. Some were in verse, some were these questions and answers, some were explanations, some were just talks which he'd give. But so there's quite a few different approaches that the Buddha used. And this sutta, we call it the Kalama Sutta, but actually it's not really, that's not the official name. It's actually called the Kesaputiya Sutta, Kesaputiya. And that is the town, it means at Kesaputta, the town of the Kalamas. That's where the Kalamas, some of the Kalamas lived. Does anybody remember another famous Kalama in the Buddhist teachings? Do you remember? His name's often mentioned. Alara Kalama, who was one of the Buddha's first teacher. So he presumably came from this area, maybe even from this town. But in the sutta, the Buddha had come to this town, Kesaputta, with a large group of monks. And it's interesting, it's good to comment that the Buddha, in those days, they didn't have print media, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have all these means of distributing teachings, disseminating is the word, I think. And so the Buddha, for 45 years, he walked around northern India, particularly the Ganges Valley, teaching people as the occasion, as whatever the occasion was, usually very appropriate to the occasion. So this is the way he spread his teachings, and his disciples did too. So the townspeople hear that the Buddha has come, and they have a stock phrase, it's good to go and see these arahants, and in India there is still, as then, quite amazing interest in spiritual or religious teachers and beliefs and practices. In India, even today, even though we think of it's Hinduism or Jainism or some Sikhism or some of these things, it's actually a lot more diverse than that, especially Hinduism. I think many, many different beliefs and practices which make it difficult to classify them. So he arrived at this town. This town was a staging town because it was on the edge, evidently, of a big forest. So people would come there, travellers would come there, and they would, stay overnight, probably get their provisions together, ready to go through the forest. It might have been a large forest. Now, sadly, gone. I think India these days is very dry. And so they would stay there. And some of the travellers would be teachers who would give their teachings. And the Kalamas tell the Buddha, some of these teachers, they teach their teaching and then they start criticising other teachers for their views, for their beliefs. And they said that because of this, they're very confused and perplexed by the contradictions. And they asked the Buddha, which one is true and which one's false? And the Buddha, this is how the background to this teaching, which one is true and which one is false. And this reminds me, maybe it reminds you too, that this day and age too, there's quite a bit of confusion too, because of the internet, there's so many different things on offer. I call it like a smorgasbord, but that's probably an old-fashioned word these days, buffet, of opinions, views, practices, beliefs. It's all there. And people, often we mix and match. We mix and match. That's the approach that we have. And these Kalamas were mixing and matching but couldn't make them fit together. As many people probably who are experiencing when they access different things on the internet, that they're conflicting, they don't fit together, some of these teachings. So this teaching to the Kalamas is very relevant today. It's very relevant for us, if we are confused and perplexed. So this is, and we're not Buddhists. This is the other thing that I emphasised before. These Kalamas weren't Buddhists. They did not necessarily have faith in the Buddha. And what were they confused and perplexed about? That's the word, perplexed. It's the same things people are confused and perplexed about today, actually, so it's worth mentioning. And it comes up later in this sutta that they are perplexed about karma and rebirth. Because in India, unbelievable variety of views and opinions. Some said there was karma, results of our actions of body, speech and mind. Some said there weren't. Some gave the example that, if one went down one bank of the Ganges and had a chariot with razor knives and cut up people, mutilated people, and then went down the other side of the Ganges and gave food, gave all the clothes, whatever people needed. There was no difference. There was no result of this. It was just the same. Wow, that's incredible, isn't it? That people could think like that. And some thought that there was no, this life was it, which is very common thinking these days. And others thought there was rebirth, that one was reborn. Some thought that, one was reborn and would be at one with Atman, if one attained liberation from human rebirth. So the variety of opinion, I won't go into it. There were about at least six major teachers at the time of the Buddha, and you hear their teachings from the Buddhist perspective. The Jains were there as well. That gives us an idea of the background and how many different views and opinions, just like today. And the Buddha comments to the Kalamas, it is fitting for you to be perplexed, Kalamas, fitting for you to be in doubt. Doubt has arisen in you about a perplexing matter. Because usually in Buddhism we talk about doubt, don't we? Think of doubt as being vicikiccha, I think, is a negative in our lives, and particularly in meditation. If we're sitting meditating and doubting whether we can do it, whether we're doing the right method, etc., it really derails the meditation. And I think when we begin meditation, we often see that. We think, oh, am I doing it the right way? He says, what did they say then? This sort of thing. So this doubt is very negative. But doubt that's based on, has a reasonable basis, in our lives. These sorts of doubts we need to address. This is it's an obstacle to our understanding, to our wisdom. It's not something that will come up probably in terms of our meditation, karma and rebirth, but it is important in terms of the way we live our lives, because it has repercussions if we believe in karma and rebirth. So, you got a bit of it, you didn't? More spiritual. Yes. So this is the core part of this talk this morning is actually what the Buddha said, that advised the Kalamas that they don't take as their basis for belief. And he said, come, Kalamas, do not go by oral tradition, by a lineage of teaching, by hearsay, by a collection of scriptures, by logical reasoning, by inferential reasoning, by reasoned cogitation. Interesting, I don't know. By the acceptance of a view after pondering it, by the seeming competence of a speaker or teacher, or because you think the teacher is our guru. But when, Kalamas, you know for yourself, these things are unwholesome, these things are blameworthy, these things are censured by the wise, these things, if accepted and undertaken, lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them. So that's a very, quite a comprehensive list of grounds that people will believe in a teaching. And the first one, the oral tradition, they didn't write things down then. They remembered it all. So that's why Venerable Ananda was really such a treasure for Buddhism, because he remembered so much. And after he passed away, they usually had groups of monks who were remembering different parts of the teaching. They didn't have one monk like Venerable Ananda, they had groups of monks. So this tradition, of course, that relates to the Vedas, you know, the Vedas in Indian, in Brahmanism, in Hinduism, are the teachings from ancient times. And a lot of the authority that a teacher would have would come from them. The lineage of teaching, and this is from a line of teachers that's usually unbroken, is another aspect of tradition that people appeal to. And we can see this even in Buddhism. And then by hearsay, and hearsay is like a report or a common belief, perhaps, that people have. And that's another aspect of sort of a tradition in a sense. By a collection of scriptures, and so this is the four that deal with tradition, so a collection of scriptures. You might think, well, hang on, Buddhism's got all these things. It has these things. But of course, this is for a Buddhist. These things are important in a Buddhist context. For the Kalamas, they're just dealing with their confusion and perplexity. So the Buddha is saying, forget all about these things, forget about them. And then, of course, he's coming at the end of it to what you experience as unwholesome. And so what you know to be unwholesome, are negative in your life. And then he talks about the various types of reasoning. This is using logic, obviously logical reasoning. Inferential reasoning is when we infer something from our experience. It's we haven't necessarily experienced that, but we can infer it. And the next one, reasoned cogitation. Wow, I can't say what that would be, but cogitation. So it's sort of going over, wouldn't it be? Going over something, pondering it. And by acceptance of a view. So this is a view, maybe a view of karma and rebirth or whatever, and pondering it. And here we are. Oh, thank you. I can see. Yeah, no, I know it's a very different translation. Yeah, yes, that's right. And this gives you an idea of how we've adapted, actually, the Buddhist words. Sometimes good, sometimes not so good. And so, and also by, that's right, the acceptance of a view after pondering it. And the last ones, by the seeming competence of a teacher, or because you think the teacher is our guru. And of course, then the Buddha is going beyond that. He's saying, but Kalamas, when you know for yourself these things are unwholesome, these things are blameworthy, these things are censured by the wise, these things, if accepted and undertaken, lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them. Oh, there we are, getting some more. Right. So this is really for the Kalamas, because they're totally confused. And the Buddha is saying, well, you know, what do you experience as unwholesome? You know, do you things that are unwholesome, do they lead to harm and suffering he's talking about? Do they lead to bad consequences? And each and every one of us can really ask that question for ourselves. And of course, pretty easy actually. You know, the negative things in our lives usually give us great grief. They cause a lot of our difficulties, our problems and suffering. And presumably these other teachers that came were giving talks to the Kalamas, were appealing on one or other of these grounds, these 10 grounds we call them, for belief. But it's very interesting that the Buddha avoids appealing on any, taking any of these 10 grounds as a basis for authority. He's just saying to the Kalamas, what is your experience? He's not saying, this is my experience, believe me. That's one of the nice things I find about the Buddha's teachings, and this sutta in particular, and other suttas, other teachings of the Buddha. He's not saying, believe me, believe me, believe me. And there's the famous sutta I like very much, the Vimamsaka sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle length talks, the medium talks, where the Buddha it's called Vimamsika, means the investigator. What are they investigating? The Buddha, whether he was enlightened. And I always say to people, how many teachers do you know who are willing to say to their to people, whether they're followers or not, please investigate to see if you can find that I'm not enlightened, and he gives a teaching on how to investigate him in a very methodical way. So this, for me, that gives rise to a lot of faith. When somebody's saying, believe me, we tend to hang back a bit. We tend to be a bit reticent. But if somebody is just presenting a teaching, not saying believe me, then we tend to be more open to that. And this is what the Buddha is doing in this sutta, in this teaching that he's giving them. All right. And so these are the grounds that the Buddha was saying that the Kalamas shouldn't go by. And it's it's a good reflection to have in mind, keep in mind that our beliefs and our views are often distorted by our defilements, by the negative aspects of our mind, so they're not necessarily reliable. This is why a teaching from an enlightened person like the Buddha is very valuable, because it's coming from a state of purity, coming from a state of wisdom. And so this is where our views and opinions can lead us into many problems. And it's good for us to reflect, that a belief is only a belief. It's not what we know. And this is a good distinction. Most of the conflicts that people experience, aren't they, are related to beliefs. They don't know this for themselves exactly. They haven't experienced this for themselves, but they believe it to be the case. And this is where I think if we are wise, we can distinguish between belief and what we have actually experienced, what we actually know. And that by that we can reduce the conflicts in our lives, the conflicts with others, on the basis of beliefs. And of course, sometimes people have these very strong beliefs and they really cling to them. They become, Buddha called them an attachment. They become an attachment. We call it dit upadana, they call it. So this is an attachment that we develop to various views and opinions. And for instance, people who have causes, for instance, they can be very, that can give them a lot of energy, but they can become very attached to their cause. Whatever that cause, many good causes, climate change, peace, and all these things. So people can become very attached, identified with it. And belief, belief is very close to what we take to be ourself. So some of these views that we have become me, they become a very important aspect of me. So when somebody says, no, that's not true, I don't believe that at all, we feel we have to defend it. We may even become attack them. Because there's the power of I believe, isn't it? I believe ... whatever it is, I believe. There is a power in that. But if we're wary about that, if we realise, no, I don't know this really, then, and what do I really know? And base our lives on that, we can reduce conflict a great deal, because we don't argue about things that are just beliefs, just ideas, just concepts. We don't really know, even if they are very dear concepts and ideas. If we stick to what we know from our own experience, it reduces those conflicts. It's very interesting. I think probably in other languages too it is. In Sinhala they have, this is Sri Lankan language, they have this ending lu, lu, which they add to verbs quite often. And it means that this is what I've heard, it's reported. So it's giving the idea, this is not my experience, this is what I've heard. So it's very good if we keep that in mind, that this is what I've heard, this is what I understand. And if we can say to people, this is what I believe, but it's not what I know, then, the conflicts are greatly reduced. And also the other thing that distorts our views, distorts our beliefs, is what the Buddha called the vipalasas. This is a distortions of reality, and particularly in relation to wanting to find permanent, something that's lasting in life, wanting to find lasting happiness, wanting to find a real solid permanent me, and also finding beauty, lasting beauty in the world. But he said the way we tend to construct our reality is by having a view, having a belief, and then from that shapes the way we perceive things. We start to look at things. Yes, this confirms that this belief, this view that I have. And then we start to think about that perception, and that further reinforces the view. So we can take it, for instance, people at a long time ago thought the earth was flat. They had that view that the earth was flat. They perceived it. Well, it's obvious. It's flat. I can see it. And they also thought about it. And so then that reinforced their view that the earth is flat. And on a psychological level, people can often have the views like. And these things are really interesting because a lot of these views, these assumptions, we've taken on board without much investigation, without really seeing if they're true. We can have the view, people don't like me. And then we can perceive, there we are, they're avoiding me. It must be because they don't like me. And then we think about it, and then it does this loop. So this is how our beliefs or views are distorting our experience, and which is why a Buddha is so important in the world. And there's a lovely story. I'll just tell this one because it's a nice story actually, and it's actually a real story. It's a true story. That's what we say, true story. In Britain, this is from Ajahn Brahm. They had the psychic research group. There was a psychic research group at Cambridge, and they organised an experiment with people. I think it was actually in London they did the experiment, and they invited all these eminent scientists to come and see a demonstration of levitation. Interesting, things rising up off the surface. So they came and they gathered, and there was this big, I think it was like a pot plant of some sort, maybe a flower or something on a desk. And it's very humorous because the person who was presenting it, who was organising it, said, "I'd like your contribution to this experiment. I'd like you to hum Om." This is a famous Indian mantra, isn't it? And while we are levitating this, in order for this to levitate. And so all these eminent scientists were omming, which would be quite interesting. I think it would be great to have videoed it. And they're omming away, and then sure enough, this pot plant starts to go to rise up from the table, and then as they reduce their omming, it goes down. And they asked some of these people, "Did you see this pot plant?" These scientists, they asked, "Did you see this pot levitate?" And some said, yes, I saw it go up, I saw it go down. Some said, no, it didn't go up, because their view was that it couldn't go up. How could it? And didn't see it go down. The truth of the experiment was they used a big electromagnet underneath the pot plant, and they needed the omming, they needed the sound to cover the sound, the hum of the magnet. So it's be great to have videoed. It'd be make a nice YouTube video, wouldn't it? So all these scientists go, Om. But they wouldn't believe, some of them, and they were honest. I think they weren't lying. I think that was their perception had been, their view was such, this is impossible, so no perception of that happening. So we continue. And one of the bases too that the Buddha is talking about here, when he's talking about the actual teacher, and he mentions. He mentions here the teacher is besides that, by the seeming competence of a teacher, or because we think that the teacher is our guru. And this, of course, buys into very much the area of feeling or emotion, that we are affected by other people, by their charisma. If they have charisma, then the emotions come up. And this is one of the very strong things that we run on, actually. The world runs on, really, is looking for this pleasant feeling. And if there's a pleasant feeling there, that can give rise to a belief or a conviction in some teaching or in some teacher. So the personal aspect is always very good to be careful of as well. And so the heart of this teaching, which I've got to get to continue to actually, so we can finish. And so then the Buddha really goes on to the experiment in what they can actually know from their own experience. He mentions, you can know the unwholesome, you can know the negative, and does that lead to your harm or to your welfare? So this is what he does. He says to them, "What do you think, Kalamas? When greed, hate, or delusion," I won't do them individually, "arises in a person, is it for their welfare or their harm?" And of course, they say, "For their harm, Bhante." And this is something we can reflect on too. When we have greedy states of mind, when we want a lot, when we're angry, when we're confused, and when we're taking things very personally, that's another aspect of delusion. Is this for our welfare or harm? Just to reflect on that. Because this is what the Buddha is asking them to do. Look at their own experience and to be honest about it. And they say, for their harm. And so then the Buddha continues. And the next passage relates to the 5 precepts actually. "Kalamas, a greedy or a hateful or a deluded person, overcome by greed, hate or delusion, with mind obsessed by them, destroys life." So this is the first precept, isn't it? "Takes what is not given, commits sexual conduct with another's partner, and speaks lies. And they encourage others to do likewise. Will that lead to their harm and suffering for a long time?" And the Kalamas say, yes, Bhante. So this is breaking the 5 precepts. I say, if one wants to lead an interesting and complex life, then breaking the 5 precepts is a very good way to do that. But we get the results ourselves. We can see if we kill others, kill living beings or harm other beings, if we steal, if we have sexual misconduct, if we lie. And the Buddha doesn't include here alcohol and drugs, but they are often a basis for a lot of difficulty in life. And so these 3 things, greed, hatred and delusion, I've been speaking about greed and hatred. You might remember from previous talks. I'm talking about greed and non-greed actually, hatred and non-hate. And then I'm hoping to talk about delusion and non-delusion later. And the Buddha said these are the 3, what are the 6 total, positive and negative roots in our minds. 3 negative roots and 3 positive roots in our minds. These are the roots, the negative roots we can overcome. This is the practice of the Buddha's path and the practice of one who becomes enlightened, because the Buddha, free of greed, hatred and delusion. That's a definition of someone who's become enlightened. They're free of these negatives in their lives. One of the things that becomes very obvious with this talk, the Buddha's talk, is a very active and very interactive, isn't it? Well, I'll give a little bit more of that. Very, because this question and answer format that he was using would have been very compelling. I don't think many of the Kalamas would drop off to sleep during this. They'd be really interested in what he was saying. And one of the important things that the Buddha is, by this teaching, is showing too, is that the Dhamma, what he is teaching, is actually a reflection on reality, and that this is here and now for us to see. It's they sometimes say timeless, or they say immediate. It's here, we can see it from our own experience. If we have the right angle, the right view, we can see it for ourselves. and it's inviting us to come and see. This is ehipassiko, and that it's applicable or leads inwards, as it says in the chanting today. I chanted leads onwards. That's another translation. So it's applicable and it's to be seen individually by the wise. So this is the nature of the Dhamma itself. And then the Buddha continues with his, could say questions. I was going to say interrogation, but it's not really. And I just give this because it gives an idea of how interactive it was. And then the Buddha says to them, what do you think, Kalamas? Are these things wholesome or unwholesome? Greed, hatred and delusion. And they say, unwholesome, Bhante. And he says, are they blameworthy or blameless? Blameworthy, Bhante. Are they censured or praised by the wise? Censured by the wise, Bhante. And accepted and undertaken, do they lead to harm and suffering or not? How do you take it? And then the Kalamas say, accepted and undertaken, these things lead to harm and suffering, so we take it. And the Buddha adds later, then you should abandon them, greed, hatred and delusion, those negatives in your life. So it gives you an idea. I mean, that sort of interchange, it's just really lively and very, it would focus the attention very much for the audience, for the people he was talking to. And it may be a little bit of a contrast to the Dhamma talks we have these days, myself included, where one person talks. But really the best sort of interaction is when people do ask questions, because that's what's important to them. And then one can respond, and so we can get into the area that's really important for that person. Sometimes the Dhamma talks may not do that. The other thing that's interesting from that is that the Buddha's not rejecting all authority, because he mentions these things, are they censured or praised by the wise? And of course that's appealing to wise people, not necessarily himself, but the general, people that are considered wise. Would they think these were good things, greed, hatred and delusion? So this is, and then the Buddha presents the opposite case for the wholesome things, and he goes, are these, so he goes through those, and the wholesome things are, let's see. Yes, he says, these things are, it's talking about the opposite case, these things are wholesome, these things are blameless, these things are praised by the wise, these things, if accepted and undertaken, lead to welfare and happiness, then you should live in accordance with them. What are these things? And he mentions non-greed, non-hatred and non-delusion. It's a very scientific way of presenting it, because many people would think, well, what's non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion? And of course, these are non-greed is any positive state of giving up desires for sensual pleasures as being, the ultimate happiness, etc. And non-hate, of course, includes all positive states like loving kindness, compassion, joy with other success, equanimity, contentment, gratitude, thanks, patience with other people. Non-delusion includes all states of wisdom and understanding, particularly in the Buddhist context, right view and right thought or right intention, where we're coming from. So the Buddha presents these three just in the same way, very methodical way that he produced the negative ones. He produces the positive ones, and he notes that a person without greed, hatred and delusion is likely to keep the precepts, is not likely to break them. So they will not harm living beings, not steal, not commit sexual misconduct, or tell lies. So he mentions that. And so he's leading the Kalamas towards their own experience, focusing on their own experience, that the unwholesome, the negative, is leading to harm and suffering, and the opposite, that the wholesome or the positive is leading to benefit and welfare. And then the Buddha goes on as probably as an example of the non-hate, non-hatred, in developing the 4 Brahmaviharas. He gives a teaching on that. So this is loving kindness, compassion. This is joy with other success with an equanimity. These are could call them the top end of the positive emotions, the top end of the positive emotions. But there are others, as I say, being thankful, grateful, being content, being patient. These are also big positives in our lives. But a person who is developing the positive in their life, this is a very good way, to let go of negative. If they're developing loving kindness, they'll let go of the tendency to act and speak in the negative, hurtful, harmful way. And so this is like a reprogramming. And it's so important for us, we recognise things for what they are, that they are negatives, they are positives in our lives, because then we can do something about it. Then we can start focusing, giving more attention to developing habits which support positive emotions, positive mind states, and decrease the negative ones. This is the whole training that the Buddha is giving. And these 4 very positive emotions of loving kindness, compassion, joy with others, success, and equanimity help do that. We're replacing, not giving so much space to negative states of mind. But then this is I've got to finish. Then the Buddha gives an assurance to the Kalamas, and this is where we understand what their problem, what their confusion was about. So he says to them that a person who practices these 4 divine abidings, that's the Brahmaviharas, loving kindness, compassion, joy with others, and equanimity. A person who does that has 4 assurances in their life. And the first one is, it's very interesting, these assurances. The first assurance they have, one, is this: if there is another world, that's like a life after this, and there is the fruit and result of good and bad deeds, it is possible that with the breakup of the body after death, I will be reborn in a good destination, in a heavenly world. So this is because some of the Kalamas, some of the teachers the Kalamas have listened to have probably said there is no other world, it's just this world. And some of them have said there's no result from what you do or say in this life. And so this is the Buddha is saying, well, if that were the case, then you still would have happiness from doing positive things and avoiding negative things as they realise from their own experience. And I often, when I talk about the Kalama Sutta, I've been talking about it before, I often misremember that the Buddha actually adds then, but as I know there is another life and there are results of karma, you will have this assurance. But in actual fact, the Buddha doesn't say that. So he's not coming from his own authority, from his own experience. He's asking them to reflect on their experience. And he's not giving his own experience, which is that there is karma and rebirth. That's what he discovered the night of his enlightenment, actually. And the second assurance, there's only 4 of them. The second assurance that they have won, these people who practice loving kindness, compassion, and so on, have won, is if there is no other world, so it's covering both options, and there is no fruit and result of good and bad deeds, still, right here, in this very life, I maintain myself in happiness, without enmity, this is without hatred and ill will, free of trouble. So somebody who develops the wholesome, whether they believe there's not if they believe there isn't another life, they still will have happiness here. And even if they don't believe there's any results of their good and bad actions, they will still have happiness if they pursue doing positive, wholesome things and speaking them. And the third one, we've got to move on. The third assurance that the Buddha mentions that they have won, there's 4 of them, is this: suppose evil comes to one who does evil. So this must be a view of karma, isn't it? It's a view of karma. If we do unwholesome, negative things, they come back to us in one shape or another. Then the Buddha continues, then when I have no evil intentions towards anyone, how can suffering afflict me since I do not do evil deeds through speech, presumably through speech and action. And this is very much along the lines of good things happen to good people. And I think it's very simple, of course, but because bad things do happen to good people too. But we can reflect, and I think this is what the Buddha is implying, that if we are engaged in a lot of unethical activity, killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct and lying, the results that come from that, will come back to us. Actually, we will experience them. At the minimum, people get caught for killing somebody else. There's big problems with stealing, sexual misconduct, and lying. So, in other words, these things really conduce to having negative effects for us. They bring suffering that afflicts one. But if we're not engaged in breaking the 5 precepts, we're protected. So that's how I would see that. Bhikkhu Bodhi, very interesting, he said, this is counterintuitive because bad things do happen to good people. And I think that's true, but not as much, I would say, as to people who do good things and think good things, speak good things, whose actions coming from a wholesome intention, a positive intention. And the last one, which is the 4th assurance they have, one, is this. Suppose evil does not come to one who does evil. That's interesting. So no result of our actions, presumably good and bad. Then right here I see myself purified in both aspects. So I think here the Buddha is meaning that because I'm not doing evil, I'm less likely to experience negative consequences. That's the first one. And the second one is that if one is developing, of course, loving kindness, compassion, and so on, these things protect one. They protect one from negative aspects, negative states of mind. So then he says, then right here I see myself purified in both aspects. He may also be referring to, because in the case before he says, suppose evil comes to one who does evil. So that may be what he means by in both ways. So he's protected from that, but also a person whose conduct is wholesome, positive, is also protected from the case, if it should be the case, suppose evil does not come to one who does evil. So in both instances. And not surprisingly, because in the Buddhist text, then the Kalamas take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Bhikkhu Sangha, because they know from their own experience that what the Buddha has taught is something that is meaningful for them. It is their experience. They can see it in their lives. So therefore they've developed some confidence, some faith in him that perhaps other aspects of his teaching they can take on board that they don't know for themselves. So this is very, very important that that way that they came to their faith, not by any authority, the Buddha saying, I'm enlightened, listen to me, believe me, I'll tell you how it is, but going to their experience and for them from that to develop this confidence that yes, this guide, this spiritual guide, this spiritual genius may have something that can help me in my spiritual practice. Because then, as I said before, once we have that confidence in anything, we're willing to undertake it. We're willing to try it out. If we don't have confidence, we think, well, maybe not. And then when we are willing to try it out, we can apply ourselves. We can use our mindfulness, as I mentioned before, to actually put into practice the teachings of the Buddha, which are, dana, giving is a very important part. Sila, this is the ethical conduct, very important part. Developing the mind, the meditation, very important part. And developing wisdom. Those 4 aspects are what we are undertaking. So then we can use this mindfulness to undertake those different aspects. And then from that, develop this one-pointedness, the mind that has come together. We call it samadhi. And that power of that mind can give rise to seeing deeply into our lives, into our experience, and seeing what the Buddha saw for ourselves. It's very important to say that the Buddha's teaching all hinges on direct experience. The Buddha's own enlightenment, that's his enlightenment. It's not our enlightenment. If we become enlightened, it's through direct experience. It has to be through our direct experience, not just believing the Buddha. So he's not, ultimately it is our experience, but what we're doing when we have this confidence or faith in the Buddha is opening up to a guide that can show us the way. And that's what he said he was. He only pointed the way. He can't walk it for us. He can't do it for us. So this is the purpose of developing this confidence or faith. It gives us the energy to really practice it. Encourages us. So I'd like to end the talk there, a little over time, encouraging all of us, to find this energy to practice. We are very lucky if one is a Buddhist, one can then open up to the Buddha's guidance for our lives. And as I say, develop the Noble Eightfold Path. Initially, it's something we read about, but eventually, slowly, it becomes internalized, becomes part of our lives, the practice becomes within us. And so this is the idea. We become more and more the Dhamma, and less of the defilements and negative qualities, less of this view of ourselves. So I encourage you all to be like the Kalamas and look into your experience, but also take on board the guidance that the Buddha gives us. All right, so if there are if there are any questions or comments people have, or complaints. I wonder if the Kalama... No, I don't think the Kalamas complained. They were pretty happy, actually. There we are. Any questions, comments, complaints? Oh.
Thank you, Ajahn, for
Yeah.
the talk.
Yes.
I was just recalling how Ajahn Tanasanti many years ago said that loving kindness can be fairy floss, pink goo. And she said that it is most important for us to really understand the source of our feelings, responses and so on. Otherwise, it can become that. So I just wondered what you thought of that.
Yes. I think that can... we often talk about Pollyanna. We say Pollyannaism, which is, looking on the bright side, looking on the positive side. Is that working? Yep. Looking on the bright side and the positive side, and ignoring the negatives in our lives. But of course, the Buddhist does look at the negatives in life, but hopefully turns them into positives too. So, for instance, with the Kalamas, they turn this doubt, this perplexity, into understanding, their own experience, and then developing that faith and confidence. But that loving kindness, this is metta or maitri, is pink goo. This is, I think, a very big misunderstanding of it. It's not really, because it's loving kindness, metta, maitri, is a power. It's something that the Buddha talks about as a liberation of the mind. It's not just this is really, 240 volts. It's really strong, and it can be the basis for enlightenment. So we're not, when we are developing loving, positive states of mind, ignoring the negative states of mind, but we're a negative state of things, other people's interactions, the situation in the world, whatever. But we fully realise that by becoming negative ourselves, our mind state becoming negative, it is not useful to us. So it's a wisdom that sees that and sees how can I positively contribute to a situation, and how can I contribute to my own happiness and well-being. This the pink goo or the Pollyanna approach to life won't really make us happy. It'll be very superficial, be like a shop window. You know, it's very nice to look at, but it's not really satisfying. It's not reality. It's not our reality. So really, this is, a deep reconditioning of the mind, our tendency to go to negative states of mind, reconditioning it to go to positive states of mind. It's not really just like even like affirmation, which, affirmation sometimes, we tend to believe the opposite, but we're saying the affirmation almost grimly in order to overcome the opposite, which is not really the way of understanding. Because of course with the Buddha's teaching, everything has to come from wisdom. And one of the things that I like very much about Ayakema, she even used to, I should do it myself actually, teach a contemplation on loving kindness. Isn't that interesting? That's actually like looking at what supports loving kindness, the wisdom that actually is behind loving kindness. Because that's very, very important for empowering the loving kindness, particularly the sense that I'm doing the loving kindness. This is sometimes a limiting factor, they say, particularly for men. I can't do loving kindness, sort of thing. And this idea that it's tied up with me doing it, I'm doing it, rather than realizing that loving kindness is a quality of the mind we can either develop or reduce. Even if we tend to focus on the negative, we can get more angry. We've got that choice, get more upset, or we can develop loving kindness. We can develop compassion, this joy with others, and equanimity. But they all have to come from wisdom. They all come from wisdom. Just as faith, we're talking about faith. If you have faith or confidence in the Buddha's teaching, it's coming from wisdom. It's never blind faith. And Ayakema used to say, blind faith, being blind. No, she said, faith can move mountains, that's the first bit. But if it's blind faith, she said, being blind, it doesn't know where to move the mountains. And that's true. There's enormous faith, enormous power in faith and confidence, which is why the Buddha emphasizes it. But if it's blind faith, if it's not coming from wisdom, it's not the right sort of a quality the Buddha's encouraging. So, yes. So thank you very much for that, Cora. That's very good. Helen, yeah?
I was wondering one day I was wondering one day, if you don't accept as fact, which was up there, something that is logical, what do you accept as fact?
Yes, very good point. Well, the point is with the Kalamas, with those 10 grounds for not accepting a teaching that's giving rise to confusion and perplexity. It is for people who haven't got a faith in that teaching. For instance, if you're not a Buddhist, if you don't have a faith in the Buddha's teaching, then most of these 10 grounds you saw up down here, they're a bit different from those ones actually, are actually things that support the practice. They support the practice for a Buddhist, but you have to have that faith actually first of all, that the Buddha was enlightened. That's the number one, isn't it? Because if you don't think he's enlightened, well, why would you, pay any attention? You think, well, what does he know? He's like everyone else. But if you accept that he's enlightened, then these 10 grounds that the Buddha mentions to the Kalamas actually become positives for us. So just try and find them. So they become. So for instance, a teacher can be an incredible source of benefit to us. Not necessarily a trap. I'm very grateful for my Buddhist teachers, all my teachers actually, whether Buddhist or non-Buddhist, because what they have given me. So these things can become great sources of benefit. And logic. The Buddha uses logic all the time. And you can see even within that teaching, you could see there's logic working, isn't there? That unwholesome, the negative, does it lead to harm and suffering? And the converse. He's using logic all the way. But he's actually, for the Kalamas, just trying to clear the ground, as it were, so that they could, just go to their experience. But he's not saying at all that these things are not helpful once one has a faith or a confidence. That's, it's obvious, because the oral tradition, Buddhism is an oral tradition, was an oral tradition, for centuries, right up until it was written down in about 70 AD, so that's a long time ago. And there's a lineage of teachers, there's a collection of scriptures, these I just talked about them actually, and the Buddha uses sometimes very sophisticated logic and reasoning. And he says, when he talks about speech, for instance, he says speech that is reasonable, that's gentle, that's factual. He talks about the qualities like that. So reason is a very important part in the Buddha's teaching. And of course, and the seeming competence of a teacher, that's another aspect, and the teacher is our guru. These are important relationships we can have that can be of great benefit for us. I feel, for me, as becoming a Buddhist, part of that was because of the lived examples I saw. And that's Ajahn Brahm, Ajahn Jagro, Ayakema, and these people, they really, especially Ajahn Jagro at that time, really inspired me. So this is very important, this connection with a living teacher. Because at that stage, perhaps the faith is not enough, that I haven't investigated the Buddha's teachings in depth, gone to the suttas, that he is teachings directly. This is the other aspect. For Buddhists, if there are controversies, and there are, I've seen a few in Sri Lanka last year, over the meaning of anicca and anatta and all these Pali words. And in the end, for a perplexed Buddhist, where do we go? Do we go to our direct experience? No, we go to the teachings of the Buddha. We see what he says about these things. He's the ultimate source, in a sense, for our understanding in these areas. Of course, when we are practicing his teachings, we have to develop them experientially for ourselves. We have to see them in our own experience. As I said, the Buddha's enlightenment, that's his. It's not our enlightenment. So he uses logic all the way, Helen. Yeah, you can see that in the teachings. They're just, I think, very sophisticated, actually, the way he presents things, actually, in a very logical way. But for the Kalamas, he's just saying, don't be impressed by all the arguments, if they seem to be really convincing because of the logic and etc. And he's trying to get them back to, did you say ground zero? Down to the basics, what they're experiencing here and now. Because they're confused and perplexed. But I say for the confused and perplexed Buddhist, the Buddha is the ultimate source for clarifying things that we're confused or perplexed about. So, does that answer? I don't know if that does. Yeah, that's good. So it's a big area, the Kalama Sutta. And if you want to see this post, if you want to actually be able to read it, you can see it next door. But of course, the best place to see it is in the Numerical Discourses of the Buddha, translated by Bhikkhu Bodhi, and it's in the number 3s, the section of the 3s. This is greed, hatred and delusion, and it's the 65 sutta in that collection. So that's where you can read it. So it's very, very good to see. And you can see for yourself what the Buddha was saying to the Kalamas. To me, it's it's wonderful the way he can be so adapt to his audience in a very, very direct way. So that's it, I think. Are there any other questions? One more, maybe, and then we have to go. It's time for the shared meal next door, the dana. I think Adrian is already there, actually, getting ready, probably guarding the food. Oh, right, this will be a deep question, I know.
There are actually 4 online questions, but I won't have time for those today, unfortunately.
All right, thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Ajahn, for such a wonderful talk.
All right, thank you.
Just asking and wondering, even if one realizes the distinction between the wholesome and the unwholesome, how does one actually develop and sustain virya to practice these and to stay away from the defilements that one encounters in day-to-day life. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's good. How does one develop the energy to sustain these things in daily life? Of course, that there has to be through a confidence or faith in the Buddha is usually presented as the source for it, but also the confidence and faith that we can do it is very important too, that others have done it, that the Sangha have done it. There have been men and women in the past who have practiced this teaching and got the results from this teaching. Then why shouldn't I, experience similar results? It's possible for me to experience similar results because the teachings are available. And so these ways, it's really, the energy has to come from motivation, doesn't it? So that's why you see so many motivating talks on YouTube. Do you see these motivational speakers? There's so many of them these days. But the Buddha was actually one of the ultimate motivating speakers, because he really motivated millions of people to practice, to actually practice and to focus on the very practical aspects of, of dana, of giving in our lives, not only to monks and nuns, but giving generally, sila, our ethical conduct, very important, what we say and do in the world, and what we think too, and then to develop the mind so we have this clear understanding, this is not wholesome, this is negative, and this is positive, this is wholesome, understanding our experience, and then developing the meditation so we can recondition the mind in very positive ways through mindfulness, through loving kindness, through all these positive things. And once we have done that, the meditation has brought some peace, the mind has come together to some degree, then we can start seeing things differently. We can start looking into things at a very deep level, and that will also give us more energy, because of course the confidence that grows when we have confirmation. It works. It really works, because when we try something out and it works, we get a lot more energy. So, for instance, even with dana, we say, wow, giving makes me feel happy. And it generally does make most people feel happy. And the same with sila. Wow, I'm not harming people, and also this is a gift to them, and it's a gift of, it's a contribution to world peace, I say. And also, when we develop the mind, we can see that this is where most people start getting their confidence in the West, is from the meditation, actually. They start to say, wow, it does make a difference. Wow, before and after is quite pronounced. And so therefore they get confidence, and that confidence gives them energy to practice more. It's a loop. And of course then as the wisdom develops, that gives even more confidence, because we see we're looking at life differently. We are, dealing with life differently than maybe we did before. And that gives real confidence, and then that gives more energy to practice, more incentive, more motivation, and more confidence and faith. So I think these are ways that we can, build it up. So it's thank you for that, Lena. Yeah, good. Now we should finish off, because now, as you're all invited, even those online, be a bit difficult, for a shared meal next door in the Sangha house. But first of all, those who would like, you're welcome to pay respects to the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. Ooh.